Okay, recording in progress, according to this, or progress, as they said. Okay, let's go. Right, so I should say, although I'm giving this lecture today, it's almost entirely based on collaborative work. I don't speak or read Chinese, and I'm not an expert in Chinese culture. So my entire research effort on the Chinese newspaper press depended on a number of collaborators. I think they deserve recognition. So in no particular order, the people I have worked with and published with, Chong Jing-rong, who is now a professor at Sheffield University in the UK, Wang Haiyan, who is now a professor at Macau, Li Ke, who is now an associate professor at, assistant professor at, I think she's at National University of Singapore, and your very own Wang Dan, who I think is a lecturer here at Baptist. So, I mean, there were other people who I worked with. Those are the people who are most, who I'm most indebted to, and those debts are very, very real. There's not enough time for me to report on all of the projects we did together. I'm going to really only talk about two of them. I won't be able to show you the kinds of contribution that many of them made, but please, accept the fact that I'm only really able to give this lecture because of the efforts of other people. My standard introduction when I presented this paper at conference is my role is to raise the money and correct the English. All of the serious work, intellectual and empirical, has been done by other people. All of the interviews, for example, I cite were done by native Chinese speakers. I want to talk about the topic at four levels. The first is the changing media system overall, what has changed, and what is changing in the Chinese media. Secondly, what the impact of the market on the press was and is. And closely related to that, the impact of digital technologies. And lastly, I want to say what that has meant for changes to the journalistic workforce. In order to talk about them adequately, I want to have general background discussion on what you call grand theory. In the previous lectures in this series, I've been stressing that all local theories, all mid-range theories, in the end depend on a grand theory. And so I thought I'd better demonstrate that, at least in my own practice, that is the case, that these are self-consciously resting in a more general account of society. One of the problems I have with this, I had many problems writing this lecture, but one of the main problems I had is the linguistic difficulties. And by that, I don't mean that I don't speak Chinese. What I mean is that some of the common terms which I would use in most of my writing, particularly writing concentrating on the West, don't really fit in the Chinese context. I think I wrote an article somewhere about how, for example, in Hong Kong, if you are a leftist, that means you're in favor of the government. And in Britain, if you're a leftist, it means that you're not in favor of the government. So one has linguistic difficulties, which, and particularly someone of my background, which I've had to wrestle with. I have tried to avoid using my own idiolect, and I've tried to use the colloquial terms which would be understood in the Hong Kong and Chinese context. The worst I have done is to put inverted commas around some of the ones I think are most, scare quotes around some of the ones I think are most, I disagree with most strongly. But I hope that my sense comes through this. So that's the very general background. So what I'm going to do now is talk about grand theory, partly because that explains why it is that I ever ended up writing about Chinese newspapers, because as I say, I'm not an expert in Chinese culture. It isn't my natural home. It was something I came to very late in my career, really only in the mid-2000s. So This grand theory, I think, partly explains how I got how I got to be doing these concrete analyses. And the starting point, I think, is the crisis of the late 1980s. As a general statement, I think that it's the duty of intellectuals to try and engage with the important issues of the day. Doesn't mean to say you have to be a critical intellectual to do that. Many administrative intellectuals engage with the major problems of the day. I'm against the idea that we should retreat into our ivory tower and not be influenced at all by what happens in the world. I think that's a luxury which maybe we can afford some of the time, but we can never afford all of the time. So the crisis of the 1980s. And one of the key characteristics of the 80s was that in most of here are the scare quotes, communist countries advocated, significant sections of the ruling elite advocated liberal economic and political reforms for opening the economy, relaxing party control over the press, for example. In 1989, in Central Europe, this resulted in revolutionary changes. The liberal wing of the bureaucracy and the moderate wing of the opposition, in most places, reached deals that they agreed to change society. And communist rule was replaced by multi-party systems, most often of a democratic nature. Not perhaps perfect examples of democracy, but nevertheless, multi-party systems with regular elections, with a certain degree of fairness and so forth. In 1991, a similar and rather more dramatic revolution took place in the Soviet Union, although the degree of democracy that resulted was then and still is, well, perhaps today is even more limited. So these are crises which took place in the 1980s in Europe. But of course, also in 1989, there was a major crisis in China. Part of, I would argue, the same overall problem, which was that the command economies in the 70s and early 80s had run out of steam and were looking for ways of opening themselves to the world market, introducing private capital and so forth. So this was a general crisis of communist systems. And it was a major crisis in China with a different outcome. There was a liberal wing of the bureaucracy, which, for example, in the 1980s allowed much more independent press and so forth. And there was, during the crisis of 1989, some accommodation between the liberal wing of the bureaucracy and the student-led opposition. That's clearly the case. But unlike in Europe, the liberal bureaucrats lost the inner party struggle, and the opposition was crushed. So in Europe, you have one outcome, which is the end of the communist rule, the establishment of a new political system, and so forth. In China, you have the continuation of communist rule. So that's a similar crisis which results in different outcomes. So China, as we all know, continued to be ruled exclusively by the Communist Party. Well, there are the democratic parties, but they really don't amount to very much. So that's the general background about, again, which I started to think about these issues. I started first, I have to say, to think about Central and Eastern Europe, but later that developed into considerations of China. How could you theorize these crises? And I think that the major theory tried to come to terms with the fact that the overall overthrow of CP rule meant fundamental political changes. I would argue, however, that social power remained in the same hands. I remember talking to a very, very distinguished media scholar called Slavko Slicha from Slovenia. And he said, well, the major change that's taken place is that the students used to call me comrade professor, and now they just call me professor. So, the social power, the power in universities remained in the same hands, the power of the police remained in the same hands, the power of the bureaucracy in the state administration remained in the same hands, the power of the army remained in the same hands, and the power in factories and so forth remained more or less in the same hands. The heads of most social institutions remained unchanged. Some were purged, there were some small purges, but mostly these people remained the same. and economic privatization, which clearly affected large sections of the labour force, mostly benefited existing managers in newspaper press, and was no exception to that. And the dominant theoretical explanation was what was sometimes called the end of history, that the world was experiencing an unstoppable democratic wave. And the development of capitalism, privatizing industry and so forth, would make the victory of capitalist democracy inevitable. The most extreme version of this was Fukuyama, an American of Japanese origin, who argued basically that everywhere would become just like the USA. That this was what was going to happen. It was what he wrote the book, The End of History. That all of these boring old things about different disputes about questions which had made up European and American history, and indeed world history, had been overcome. An alternative theory to this was what I call elite continuity, which said that the political shape of the state changed. These states, let's say Poland or Hungary, went from, or indeed Russia for that matter, went from being one-party states to being multi-party states. They went from having key appointments filled by the nomenklatura to political elections and so forth. But the same social group maintained monopoly of power. In Russia, they have a slogan, which is that they now have Komsomol capitalism. Komsomol was the communist youth organization. The people who took over the industries were younger members of the communist elite. And this isn't just about Central and Eastern Europe, but I think it's a more general theory of what underlay what was undoubtedly a democratic wave around the world. I think from I would put it start in Portugal in 1974, where an ancient semi-fascist regime was overthrown, through to South Africa in 1994, where a disgusting apartheid regime was overthrown and replaced by something which is at least formally a democracy. There was the same dynamic. Different elements in that dynamic, different degrees of continuity, different degrees of change, but overall, the same social group retained a monopoly of political power. In its original formulation, this theory argued that a political revolution was an essential element in the process of renewal. So that's the overall background. This theoretical question can be seen, China can almost be seen as a laboratory for this. It's emerged as the most prominent exception to the crisis of 1989. Yes, Cuba did, yes, North Korea did, yes, Vietnam did, but they are, the phrase is, I suppose, small beer compared with the survival of the Chinese Communist Party, which remained ruled by the CP. But after 1992, across the river in Shenzhen, Deng Xiaoping launched extensive economic reforms, which enshrined a high degree of marketization. And I don't think I need to go over the fact that that was, probably the major social transformation the world has ever experienced in terms of industrialization, shift from the land to the city, and so forth. For many theorists, Cold War warriors in particular, these changes were just window dressing. They were of no significance. They argued that China remained and remains fundamentally a totalitarian communist state. And you can read that in American newspapers every day. that there remains a sense that these changes are not really historically important. According to the end of history thesis, economic changes would challenge the centralized decision-making process of the state-led economy. That economic liberalization would therefore lead to political liberalization. Development, growth of modern industry, extension of education, rising living standards, and so forth, would produce a new middle class that would demand democracy. That the middle class was claimed, still is in many places, is the engine of democracy. What they mean by the middle class is another question, but that's a slogan you read everywhere. And therefore, sooner or later, China would experience its own democratic revolution. According to the elite continuity thesis, the economic changes would certainly have an effect, but they would allow the CP leadership to recruit new blood from the emerging entrepreneurial layers, like Jack Ma, for example. Yes? Clearly an emergent entrepreneur who, clearly also a party member, and incidentally enrich themselves and their families. And I don't think we need to go into any detail about the mechanisms, both legal and illegal, whereby that has been achieved. It would produce a new middle class, but that would at least tolerate the existing regime, provided material conditions improve continuously. But an economy growing at the rate of 10% per year was creating new millionaires and new people with, I remember talking to, when I first started to discuss China, with people who are now 20 years older than most of you in the audience, and saying, can you remember life before you had a television set? Yes. Can you remember life before you had a motor car? Yes. Can you remember life before you had a refrigerator? Yes. All of these real material gains were things that millions of people in China experienced. There were definite evidence that communism worked. Fundamental political change, according to this thesis, remained uncertain. There's no guarantee that there would be change or that it would be a democratic change. Could have been all sorts of ways. So this is all generalized social theory. The media is one good way to examine the purchase that these theories give us on reality. If we look at what is or was generally held by the Chinese media, Cold War theories centered on the analysis of propaganda. They did in 1950, they did in 1960, they did in 1970, they did in 1980, in 1990, in 2000, in 2010, in 2020. If you want a very clear contemporary articulation of this, there's a New Zealand scholar called Anne-Marie Brady, who basically writes very, very detailed and very, very well argued analyses of how propaganda apparatus in China controls the media. The media themselves were largely based on the Soviet model. In the case of Xinhua, Russian experts arrived in Beijing in the 1950s and showed you how to build a news agency. And of course, the media remained politically subordinated to the party. And according to Cold War theories, the primary task is disseminating the views of the party. Marketization theories, a media-specific version of the end of history thesis, argued that the media were increasingly dependent upon market forces. That in order to maximize revenues, in order to continue to rely on market forces, the media needed to serve their audience's needs. And that therefore a contradiction would develop between the political role of the party and market imperatives. And that these would lead to conflicts inside the newspaper press. These are both clearly have important, correct dimensions, yes? Both in the 1990s and today. The party certainly exercises control over the media. It's unquestionable. We'll ask in a bit more detail later what that means, but they certainly exercise control over the media. And the media had and still have an important economic dimension. If you want to, for example, to look at a study that examines how newspapers benefited from advertising, there's a 1996 or 7 article which Steve Goh is part of which shows in detail how the early phase of that worked. But I think developments have shown that the two pressures do not necessarily pull in alternative dimensions, in opposite dimensions. And I think any adequate theory of the Chinese media has to recognize the complexity and contradictions which are present in a social institution which is under two sometimes contradictory, sometimes complementary pressures. I put it in long words, there's no ontological incompatibility between market and state. And the balance between them changes over time. It was different in 1990s, 1997, 98, 99, 2000, than it is in 2020, 2021, 2022. Changes over time, and it changes over space. It was, and perhaps still is, different in Shanghai than in Guangzhou, for example. So these balances between the two need to be concretely analysed. You can't simply say, oh, it's all the market, or it's all propaganda. You have to concretely analyse the relationships between the two. Now to become even more concrete, what did we do? I'm reporting here on 2 studies out of I think 4 or 5 that we did at the time, during the time I was in Hong Kong. Both were concerned with what you can call the political economy of the press, and both focused on the provincial level press. We selected our sample on a geographic basis to reflect different levels of development. There are 30 odd provincial level news organizations in China, and we couldn't go all of them. So we said, okay, we have to have a purposive sample. We have some in the south, Guangzhou, what a surprise. Some Shanghai, the far north, somewhere in it's Harbin, we went northeast. I think we went to, well, I say we, my collaborators went to Wuhan, they went to the southwest, they went to and so forth. We tried to get the different levels of economic development and political, because things are different in the far north than they are in the far south. Things are different in the far west than they are in Shanghai and so forth. So we tried to reflect that. Both of these studies were qualitative, based on in-depth interviews. So they've got the strengths and the weaknesses of qualitative studies. Overall, there were 172 interviews done, which is quite a large number of interviews. I mean, I've read PhD theses with 20 and 30. This is quite a major project. And we interviewed all levels of the press. I say we. All levels of the press were from board members of the press group down to frontline journalists reporting on this, that, and the other. So it's an attempt to get a broad picture of what the practices of journalism and practices of the press looked like across China during what was actually in the late late 2010s, 2016, 17, 18. We were doing this research. We did do a longitudinal content analysis to identify what changes there were in the material that's produced. I'm not going to talk about that today. That's I haven't got time to discuss that. All of the interviews were conducted by Chinese native speakers, so there was no translation problems for me. The main investigator, the person who did most of it, had been herself a very successful investigative journalist with Southern Weekend and Southern Metropolitan Daily, so she knew a bit about journalism in a way that perhaps I don't, well, at least not this kind of journalism. Respondents were, of course, offered the standard ethics briefings, which all of you, when you do field work, will have to do, and they were offered anonymity, and many of them didn't request anonymity, but we treated everybody anonymously. There are no names in this. Were they permitted? We recorded interviews, and many of them did. And this is one of the main surprises when very first time I started looking at Chinese news organizations. People talk to you. You can go and talk to a senior journalist, and he'll give you, or she will give you a serious interview. Whereas you try and talk to a journalist on the Financial Times, you'll ring up and you'll get a section. Oh, they'll ring you back, and they never do. Yeah, I mean, almost impossible to get to. I mean, it was difficult to get to journalists and particularly more managers in the UK. China is much more open. Yeah? People much more ready to allow you to interview them and to record the interviews. That was a very positive, and for me at least, very surprising discovery. Articles based on this, if you want to follow them up, published in, given 3 or 4 titles here: Journalism Studies, journalism practice, journal of communication, and so forth. If you want to find the details of these particular studies, don't search on my name, because you'll get all sorts of rubbish about all sorts of different things. Search on well, Haiyan Wang, actually, would be in the university catalogue. She was the main collaborator with me on this project, not the only collaborator, but by far the main collaborator. So, if you want to read this stuff, that's where you'll find it. So what we began to find was about the market and the press. We found that, and this wasn't a surprise, there had been a golden age of the press. During the 1990s and early 2000s, the readerships of many titles had increased rapidly. Advertising revenues had increased rapidly. There were newly launched commercial titles, both the metro titles and ones aimed at specific social groups, were the main beneficiaries of this market success. And very often the party press titles, the main party organs in press groups were subsidized by the commercial titles. So if you like, the economic weight of the press groups, which by 2000 or so were the way in which the press was organized, was very much towards the commercial end of the market. Whereas the party titles, while still politically central, were in a sense, gestural. And this shift of economic power led to the possibility, and I must stress a possibility, of greater journalistic autonomy. It was most fully realized where the local political leadership was most sympathetic. Guangzhou is the poster boy case of a party leadership which not only promoted but defended some kinds of journalism. But it's important to remember that it was a small number of people who developed investigative journalism and critical journalism. Maybe 300 or 400 people out of 250,000 journalists in China. So it's a small, but a very, very influential group of journalists. I remember when I first encountered Chinese students talking about the Chinese press, it was always Southern Weekend that they talked about, that was the journal to which they thought that they wanted to talk about. So again, this kind of journalism was not the norm. There's a very, very good book a very good article based on the book by Jonathan Hassid, where he produces a typology, 4 kinds of Chinese journalists. There are, he says, there are party loyalists who are party professionals. There are some journalists who want to be like American journalists. There are some journalists who want to be Chinese-style investigative journalists, and their peculiar features a very interesting question. But most journalists are workaday journalists. What they want to do is get through the day, get paid, not cause any trouble, follow orders, blah 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 blah. So the tiny group of investigative journalists were not the norm, but they were very influential. And of course, in the press at the time, there were many abuses of political power and of market power: red envelope journalism, newspapers following political instructions because the brother-in-law of the party secretary had been dumping chemical waste from his factory, and they couldn't report that because they were told not to, and so on. All sorts of things. If you want good examples of that, Zhao Yuezhi has written at least 2 books which have that stuff in great detail. It's important also to remember that investigative journalism was not necessarily problematic for the party. It flourished most in those titles where they got some support from the provincial party leadership. But in places where it didn't, there were ways in which you could evade restrictions. I remember working with, writing an article with Tong Jingrong back in the 2008, I think it was 2009, a long time ago. You find it in Journalism, I think, where she had worked as a journalist for Southern Weekend, among others, and she described how the story about how they were investigating a a coal mine disaster in I think it was Shanxi, the reason why they could say anything they wanted about that was because it wasn't in their province. They could criticize the leadership or the activities of other provinces without having any problems. That loophole has subsequently been closed, but it was the case that they could, amazing stories about how the local propaganda department booked every hotel room in the province in order to stop journalists coming and reporting on the disaster. And they had to find ways around that, all sorts of ways that was. And of course, you could always, what we would call in the West, punch down. Yes, if you were a provincial party paper, you could criticize the party leadership at a lower level than the province, at the city level and so forth. It's also important to remember that the space for this work was always fragile. One of the reasons it was fragile was because journalists, as C.C. Lee and Huang Yu, in a couple of very, very good articles, one about Shenzhen, one about Shanghai, showed how journalists were effectively part of the lower layers of the new elite. They were among the members of the middle class who had benefited greatly. They were well off. Yeah. So you're doing well. Well, the world looks not too bad to you. Yeah? So they were relatively privileged, and there was always a temptation to compromise. Some journalists were enthusiastic party members. Others were earning a living. The party policies could and did change. In Guangzhou, for example, famously, they allowed some things, indeed defended their journalists against the central party on some occasions, but other times they adopted different policies. But I think, that if you say this, what does this development do in terms of the major theoretical questions I started off with? It gives support to the end of history interpretation. Here we have a developing market, which makes it more possible for journalists to criticize power, to put forward different viewpoints and so on. So this looks as though it's a support for the end of history interpretation. Here's a quotation. I think it's, one of the things I like doing in articles is letting other people speak for themselves, unlike the way when I'm speaking. This is, I think, perhaps the best description of the golden age that we found. And this is an informant, I can't remember where he's from, but anyway, informant 5B, yeah? Talking about, I joined the Metro, the Metropolitan title, in 1996, and in 1997, it started publication. I was the news director in the first year. I remember at that time, the group leaders said that it was okay if it took several years for us to be able to make a profit. But we were making a profit in just 1 or 2 years. Suddenly, we earned lots of money, tens of millions of yuan. This was about 1999. The influence of the party newspaper was very weak at that time, and nobody read it, even though they subscribed. But when it came to the Metro newspaper, it seemed everyone was reading it, on the street, in the restaurant, at home, after a meal. And we had a great sense of being respected. Advertising was pouring in. Money came in, clang, 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 clang. Soon it increased to 300 million, 400 million, 500 million, 600 million. The party paper, on the other hand, only made 20 or 30 million. Such a difference. And he goes on, our reporting at that time was also very aggressive. The president of the group said, beside me, no other editors or party members in the group's executive board can interfere in the editorial decisions of the Metro. At that time, we did a lot of negative, that's critical reporting. There were always people who wanted to stop us from publishing it. They would get the group executives to come and speak to us. I remember I had so many phone calls when I was on duty at night. But every time I received a phone call, I told them, you need to go to speak to the president. If he says withdraw it, I will withdraw it. Otherwise, I will do as I decide. I will continue to publish it. I will not listen to you. If I withdraw this report and withdraw that report, how can I run a newspaper? At that time, truly, the Metro was in one word, Ingqi, tough, firm, confident, proud. So I think, that I think sums up the golden age quite well. That it's, commercial newspaper, very successful, and on the back of that, the group backs them to expose, you know, all sorts of crimes and corruptions. The main thing we found was the golden age is over. The introduction of digital technologies has had an impact on the press around the world. That's, you know, very, very well known. And China is no exception. One important difference is that the crisis starts later. Advertising revenue in the Chinese press rises until 2011, whereas in the Western press, it begins to decline in about 2005. In fact, it falls faster and further in the Chinese case than it did in the West, but nevertheless, it's slightly later and a similar trajectory. And therefore, there was a major shift in the financial situation of the newspaper groups. Mobile phones, in the West, it started off with computers, but in China, mobile phone was the mechanism which shifted the audience online. And advertisers moved the bulk of their business online. Chinese newspapers, of course, launched digital editions in websites, apps, and so forth, Weibo accounts, blah, blah, blah. But as everywhere, these do not attract the lost advertising back. Some of it, yes, but not all of it. Most of it goes elsewhere. And the audience also spend more time on entertainment sites than they do on newspapers. Newspapers aren't the places where you find out the juicy stories about tax evasion by famous Chinese film stars, for example. It's on entertainment sites, which incidentally are not supposed to report the news, but do to a certain extent. And of course, at the same time, there's been a tightening and re-centralization of political control. But Xi Jinping notably has re-emphasized the party character of the press. So forces which apparently were pushing in different directions now seem to be pushing in the same direction. And the shifts have had different impacts on different titles. Some have closed, but subsidies have re-emerged as important financial sources for the party papers. And the balance in the press groups has shifted as a consequence from the commercial to the party papers. And the space for critical reporting has shrunk as commercial success has evaporated. Not only because of commercial difficulties, but also because of the re-centralization of political control. This is, I think, a quotation which sums up the change situation rather well. Again, I have no idea where he or she lived, but lives. When we did well economically, the government respected our newspaper. The reporters enjoyed high social status. Even the most junior little reporter was great. I remember one of the most influential reports we did was a series on bans. We ran 8 articles in which we examined how the different bans issued by the government were implemented, which was enforced, which not enforced, and why there were these differences. When we ran the 8th report, the government was clearly worried. The propaganda director asked to see me and said, "Can we discuss this? Could you stop for a while and perhaps you can continue next year?" That was the manner in which the propaganda director talks to us. He discussed with us and wanted us to understand his reasoning. Now it's simple and direct. No reporting on this. If you do, you face punishment. There's no room for negotiation. So the shifting economic shift has led to a shift in the ways in which political power exerts itself over the journalists. And we argued that what has happened as a result of this is the development of what we call marketing credibility, selling the credibility of the titles. I mean, when we wrote this article for in journalism studies, we had to include a section where we pointed out that actually Chinese newspapers do have credibility, you know, because in the West everyone thinks, oh, nobody believes that sort of thing. You know, who believes what a Chinese newspaper says? Well, actually, there are a series of studies which show Chinese newspapers have much more credibility than American newspapers. But what they did was they marketed that credibility. First thing, merging advertising and journalistic staff. You know, to a much lesser extent than the USA, where, you know, historically in a newspaper, say the New York Times or Chicago Sun Times or whatever, there would be a big, sharp differentiation between the journalists and the advertising staff. Yeah? It's such a big thing that they would have different lifts. They weren't even allowed to get into the same lift together. If you want the advertiser, you want one lift. If you're the journalist, you want another lift, because the paper didn't want them mixing. You know, that extreme in China, but there was a differentiation between journalistic staff and advertising staff, which is being eroded. This is, again, I have no idea who. We have 14 staff who are divided into the real estate division, the food and tourism division, the finance division, and the automotive division. This is a new department, by the way. We do both content production and advertising. In fact, we feel like we are contracted fields within our media group. We are kind of making contacts with the newspaper group for contracts with the newspaper group for the use of these pages in the newspaper. The newspaper rents this space to us and sets us a yearly target of 12 million yuan in advertising revenue. So we both have to produce editorial material and sell advertising. Now our worry is to finish the editorial task and meet this more than 10 million yuan advertising target. So there's a clear erosion of the difference between journalistic and advertising. That's happening also in the West, but not quite as strongly as this. Making revenue raising a duty of journalistic staff. No longer you're just a reporter, but this is what C2 said. His value is not just in bringing information to the newspaper, and which the newspaper then sells to the public. He should be able to integrate resources and bring the benefits to the newspaper. What we need is a useful reporter. Sounds like Thomas the Tank Engine, really useful engine. A useful reporter. The meaning of useful is that what he is doing should meet the current needs of the newspaper, such as the ability to find potential revenues. So now we want journalists to have multiple talents. So the idea that a journalist is someone who reports the news is being replaced by the idea of journalist as someone who hunts for advertising as well as writing stories. Establishing promotional collaboration with commercial entities. The reason we can successfully organize these activities is because we are the most influential newspaper in our city. The resource we have is the trust of the citizens of our city. That is also what other companies need nowadays. We provide a platform for these companies to communicate with citizens through organizing those activities. And they were things like trade fairs and competitions and all sorts of things. This platform is successful because it is based on our newspaper as a medium, which is quite different from these companies organizing such marketing activities themselves. Our biggest advantage is media credibility. The public will trust products that have been promoted by the newspaper and believe that they are not defective. In other words, the credibility that the newspaper had established, largely during the Golden Age, is now being used to form deals with, let's say, real estate companies to promote new developments. And a move in terms of what the key tasks of the newspaper are towards providing services to customers rather than information to citizens, different kinds of stories about different kinds of things. Services can include a lot of things, including daily living, education, leisure, tourism, even pensions and so on. Thanks to the credibility of our newspaper, we've been able to develop different programs to promote these services. Our newspaper has some influences in this city. We have a reputation. Because of this reputation, we can run this business. So a way of marketizing credibility, making credibility of the newspaper something which earns it money. And that, I think, is a big shift from the idea that, that what you were doing was fearlessly exposing corruption or whatever. In these circumstances, the party press has a significant advantage. This is a quotation from, again, B11. I can't remember where he was or where she was. In the current environment, the newspaper group has a clear strategy of cultivating government advertising as the new economic growth point, since local governments need the influence of the newspaper. We have a good brand, and that is our influence. We made use of it and organized a number of interviews. We went to provincial cities and we told them, we can promote the image of this place through our party newspaper, commercial newspaper, online sites, news apps, clients, WeChat accounts, and other channels, and make them known to the public. In return, I directly told them that I have to put up some image advertising. they generally welcomed such cooperation. Up to now, we've been to more than 20 counties, cities, and districts. The effect is very good. If we can regularize such operations, our annual income is guaranteed. So they're selling the publicity potential of the newspaper in order to receive additional advertising from government bodies, basically. And in this circumstance, the party press is the key thing, because it's one of the mechanisms that, let's say, the provincial leadership will read the provincial newspaper in order to find out the good and the bad about lower levels of the apparatus. And if they read good stories in the provincial press, then the lower officials will be promoted. If they read bad stories, they'll be disciplined. So this gives the party press a real advantage in terms of selling this kind of advertising. So a shift towards a much more what's the word for it? Much more ruthless use of the resources in the newspaper in order to raise money rather than to report events. The next thing we found was we looked at the journalistic workforce, and we found a major change in the journalistic workforce, which was not predicted by the theory which began our study. And this is another lesson, I think, for doctoral students, which is that sometimes if you conduct research, you find things which are important and interesting, which don't fit your theoretical framework. And you can do one or two things. You can either ignore them, or you can start to try and think about them. And we started to try and think about them. We weren't expecting to find this major shift in the journalistic workforce. There was really a sharp difference in what older journalists and younger journalists told us about themselves, their role, their functions. A really sharp difference, and we didn't expect to find this quite as clearly, well, at all, actually. We had to theorize it. We moved from these empirical observations, we looked for a theory. We came across the classic theory of Karl Mannheim, which I had read 50 years before as an undergraduate student, and vaguely remembered this Hungarian sociologist who had a theory of generational change. And we went back and dug him out, and he did seem to say some interesting things. And one of his key things is the generation unit represents a much more concrete bond than the actual generation as such. Youth experiencing the same concrete historical problems may be said to be part of the same actual generation, while those groups within the same actual generations which work up the material of their common experience in different specific ways constitute separate generational units. And we argued that there were separate generational units of journalists who had worked up the experience of being a young journalist in the 1990s and early 2000s, and being a young journalist in 2010s, 2020s. We identified the first group as the reform and opening up generation. We were going to call it the golden age generation, but we found a quote from an American scholar which said that when people talk about golden ages, they're invariably misremembering their youth. But this reform and opening up generation is extremely thoroughly studied. Wang Hai and Tong Jingrong both written books completely independently of me, which look in great detail at this. There are many other studies. Hasid, Repnikova is a recent one. That this has been the main digging point of studies of Chinese journalists, and what these can be characterized by. This is a quotation again from somebody else from the Southwest, I guess, in fact, it's SW. In at least some cases, he put it, in the golden age, the newsroom was filled with journalists who were mighty tigers. Lin Ya Li Chi De Lao Yu. Sorry. Nowadays, they have become tame lambs. Wen Shun De Shao Miao Yang. You can read it more clearly than I can. I can speak it.
温顺的小绵羊.
Thank you. Which summed up the change that we thought we'd found. Of course, the critical stance was never true all journalists. They were not all mighty tigers, yeah? And most famous and successful titles, Southern Weekend, Beijing News, and so forth, were titles that employed such journalists. Many of these mighty tigers have left the industry for places like public relations, where they can earn more money and when they're under less supervision. And those that remain are very disoriented. This is what one told us. We used to be very simple. We were more passionate about the job. When we produced news, we did not need to think about irrelevant things. We only need to think about how to make the stories better, the page layout better. Now there are more negative energies in ourselves and in relations between colleagues. Reporters will complain that their reports are not published, their pay is bad, and they are facing lots of pressures, both personally and politically. So there's been a demoralization of this generation of mighty tigers. The new generation, the digital generation, we were going to call it the third generation, but we thought there might be trouble. First of all, they're much less well paid than their predecessors have been. You remember the Lee and Yu and her, actually, as a third author, studies of journalists in the about 2010, I think. And the fact they've been very well paid was one of the key factors. Now they're less well paid. This is someone in, I guess, the Northeast. A relative asked my mother, "What is your girl doing now?" "A reporter in the provincial capital." Then everyone thinks, wow, what a good job. She must earn big money, 7,000 or 8,000 a month at least. This, remember, is the Northeast, yeah, 7,000 or 8,000 a month. But who knows? Only my mum knows. Everyone says the 90s generation is never short of money. Yes, I can rely on my parents for money, but I'm a grown-up now, and sooner or later I will get married and have my own children. How can I afford that? You don't want your parents to support you forever. If it continues like this, I cannot live. I can't always be earning 1,000 or 2,000 a month. So, genuine economic difficulties, a genuine sharp fall in journalists' income. Secondly, they're much less committed to a critical stance. To tell the truth, I became a reporter not because I think society needs me to be one, it's just my personal preference. It's hard to say that I'm looking for pride or honor. I just enjoy being a reporter. Many people say that the current political environment is not so good. News is becoming boring, but I'm fine. If you don't let me write negative stories, I'm okay with not writing them. I'm not obsessed with things like exposing the dark side of society. I don't have that strong sense that journalists have social responsibilities. As long as there are things I find interesting, I can carry on. And these younger people feel estranged from older journalists. I don't really like the older generation of media people. Because the media was so good in the past, they were held in too high esteem. They cannot let go of that sense of superiority as a big journalist. I don't like it very much. I feel my friends and I don't buy this kind of self-contained feeling. We do not feel that we are morally superior to anyone else. So a real shift in self-image and a change in the attitude towards what the function of being a journalist is. It's now a step towards a better paid and different job, for example, in public relations. I think this is a wholemeal learning opportunity. This is a young journalist who himself had been gone into journalism feeling that he was going to be a mighty tiger, but had found very quickly that there was no opportunities to be a mighty tiger. And he's now treating it as a wholemeal learning opportunity. It gives me the necessary training in a full range of skills. It is very helpful for a person like me who just came from the ivory tower and knew very little about society. From here, I can then switch to different jobs like marketing, public relations, or others. So a very instrumental view of journalism. And historically, journalism has always been quite a young person's occupation, but here it's consciously seen as being a way of moving to better paid and less demanding occupations. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, for media theory, I think it's pretty obvious that neither the party propaganda or the liberation through market press illuminate the market, really illuminate the press to any direct degree. They're neither of them adequate. Yes, there's party propaganda. Yes, there is a market, but that doesn't really explain these changes. The criticism of political economy in the Chinese case while in the West the economy is central, in China it's politics. There's a famous article by C.C. Lee who argues that, that you Western political economists have got nothing to say about China because you talk about the economy all the time, and really it's politics. I think that's true about many Western studies that just do look at, so well, Rupert Murdoch owns this, or blah blah blah. But the evidence presented here is that the economic dimension is of central importance also in China. That, in other words, I don't want to ditch political economy. I think this shows that political economy has something to say, not everything to say, but something to say about the Chinese press. And the developments here require an analysis that integrates both dimensions. There is an interplay between the political and the economic in the Chinese case, which I think I've tried to demonstrate. The relationship is a variable one, and neither is necessarily dominant. This relates to another important finding I haven't been able to explore here, which formally put is media outcomes are the resultant of different teleological projects. If you want to follow that up, there are a couple of articles by me and Zheng Wen'er. They're about Chinese television, but the argument is that in any complex social organization, there are different pressures, and that the results, the outcomes, can't be reduced to one of those. They are the result of a negotiation, if you like. Sometimes a pretty brutal negotiation between different people who want different things, which is what a teleological project is what you want to do. I think that that I think is a much better approach to Chinese media than the monocausal approach. There's no automatic link between market forces and press autonomy. In the golden age, media companies made an economic decision to place their advertising in the media. Sorry, that's a mistake. Other companies made an economic decision to place their advertising in media. That's true. Yes, marketing, advertising did allow a degree of press autonomy. But the decision today to move advertising to other outlets in the digital age is equally an economic decision. So economic decisions opened space in the press, and today they're closing that space in the press. There isn't a monocausal link between marketing and press autonomy. And press autonomy is threatened as much by market forces as by political power. So in terms of media, that I think are the short-term lessons. Translating them to grand theory, where I began, the Chinese newspaper press does not bear out the projections of the end of history approach, that we are not moving inevitably towards a situation where everywhere in the world is just like the USA. The political trajectory of the Chinese press is not one of open conflict and revolution, but of partial openings and partial closures. There was an opening in the 80s, which closed after 89. There was an opening in the 90s, which closes after perhaps, well, it starts to close in the early 2000s, and certainly is pretty clearly closed by 2012. Partial openings and partial closures. The economic trajectory is not one of constant growth, it's one of prosperity and penury. Rapid growth from 1996 to 2011, sharp decline after 2011. So both the political and the economic operate in much more contradictory ways than the end of history theory suggests. At the moment, there's both political closure and economic penury. It's a difficult time to be working in the Chinese press. And there's no evidence of a systematic conflict between market forces and CP power. But you can find lots of conflicts, lots of times when journalists have been jailed, for example, because of what they wrote, but not a systematic conflict. More generally, it does not look like we're living through a wave of global democratization. On the contrary, I think hardly anyone these days would point to us living in a democratic wave. And the studies of transitional societies, which there are there are many, yes, the term transitional societies, which assumed that, let's say, Thailand was moving from being a royal legitimized dictatorship through military dictatorship through to a democratic society. That isn't how it's worked. There have been a series of different elections and coups and elections and so forth. Yeah? And that's much more general, I think. These aren't transitional societies in any neat sense of moving from democracy to moving from authoritarian rule to democracy. And indeed, one could argue that the main tendency, even in the advanced countries like the UK and the USA, is towards more and more authoritarian legal situations. I think the elite continuity approach fits much better than the end of history approach. I think it needs modification. Its original version said you have to get rid of the Communist Party before you can marketize. Clearly not true. Clearly China has retained communist rule and economic liberalization. So there's a modification to that. But nevertheless, China has changed the economic basis of its society while the CP retains power. Of course, this is only evidence of 30 years, so who knows? And things might still change. And personally, I'm still very keen on some elite discontinuity. But the evidence seems to be, up until now, that looking at the Chinese press, what it points to is elite continuity. Okay, that's all I have to say. And I think for once I've managed to do it in 1 hour, which is a remarkable achievement. Okay. I'll take questions, criticism, whatever. Stormy applause. I don't mind.
Thank you so much, Colin. Yeah. So I read all these papers, so it was good that this time was you just interpreting this. So so it's good for me to redo it again. Yeah. So let's open the floor. If you have any questions, please open your camera or you can directly speak, or you can type on the chat box.
Oh, well, that's the norm. Okay, my normal interlocutors are not have no questions.
Okay, let me ask.
One of my normal interlocutors.
Again, on a lighter note, while India is not playing its role internationally, let me play sort of India's role here, at least, to be counted as valid participant in the international affairs. So, Professor Sparks, I mean, if I had missed the introduction of your presentation, I would have got a sense that you're talking about India in many ways. So I was completely blown away by the similarities, because of course I don't know much about the Chinese press and the culture and the party and the forces there, how it works, apart from how limited information we get by reading the Western press, because our knowledge as Indians, our knowledge about China is largely influenced by what we read in the Western press, including research articles largely written by Western scholars, which give you a sense of, okay, things are wrong there. And the media is completely corrupt, and there's no hope for Chinese media to do anything that could serve the purpose of humanity. But then when I was going through slides and was listening to you, it gave me a sense that, my goodness, things are not very different in our country, which is a recognized democracy. And particularly on one of your slides, when you said the slide under media theory, where you say the criticism of political economy in the Chinese case is that while in the West the economy is central, in China it is politics. But I think currently in India, I think there's is it either or? Is it like either market or politics? Or is there a possibility, are they mutually exclusive? Or is there a possibility that they're equally dominated by both sides and there's no way to find out which outweighs which? Does it make sense, Professor Sparks?
Yes, it does. And I mean, obviously, I mean, I'm not an expert on the Indian, well, I'm not an expert on China either, but I'm not an expert, even less of an expert on Indian case. But I would, I'd say that there is a similar issue at present, yeah, present in both cases. Although it's much more developed in, as far as I know, in the Chinese case. In China, there is a clear and unequivocal link between economic and political power. And that, you know, once upon a time, back in 1965 or whatever, they were identical. You know? What the reforms did was open some space between them, but they are still linked to a much greater extent than, let's say, in the USA, where politics and economics are, they're not separate, but they are more loosely articulated, if I might borrow a word from Stuart Hall. India is, I think, is an interesting case. It has always had a strong private capitalist class, right back to the people who funded the independence struggle. Yeah? But it is argued that in the last 20 years or so, there has been a closer integration between basically the BJP and a number of the more recently successful, they're not oligarchs in the Russian sense, but billionaires, let's call them, yes, and that this is having an effect on the ways in which news is presented and conducted. But I think it's still quite a long way from the Chinese integration. I mean, you know, BJP does not have a party secretary in the Hindu's newsroom who, you know, can tell the editor what to do, whereas that's true in Chinese all the time. That, you know, that there is a party organization. In our case, the provincial propaganda committee was able to tell journalists, cover this, don't cover that, cover this in this way, don't cover it in that way, and so on. And there are lots of studies which, Tom Jing-won has done a lot of stuff on this, about how in minute detail, or Wang Dan actually has done stuff on this as well, about how in minute detail the party directives influence journalistic practice. I mean, as far as I know, and that's not very far, that isn't the case in every Indian newspaper. Maybe the case in some, I don't know. And, you know, obviously the Hindi language newspapers are completely, well, not just the Hindi language newspapers, but the newspapers in what Westerners call the vernacular languages are completely impenetrable to me. So, I mean, the person you should talk to is Swati Maheshwari, who has written interestingly on this, one article with me, but other articles on her own, who I think is probably much more sympathetic to your point of view than I am. Perhaps that's because she knows more than I do. but I still want to say that, you know, that India remains under stress, but nevertheless a democratic society. China, for all its strengths and all its wonders, is not a democratic society, and that political difference reflects itself in different ways in which politics and economics are articulated, which is particularly acute in the case of the press or television, for that matter. I just happen to be interested in the press. So I'm interested that you identify similarities, but I personally, on virtually no grounds whatsoever, I'm afraid, suspicious of the conclusions you draw. Yes, I mean, I don't think the BJP is a CPC. You know, different kinds of organizations. I mean, the RSS might actually become this a totalitarian power in India, in the same way as, you know, totalitarian is an awful word and doesn't really mean anything, but an authoritarian power which penetrates every image of every aspect of society. Sorry, the RSS is, for those of you who aren't Indian, is a paramilitary organization, often accused of being fascist, closely related to the BJP. And I believe that Modi himself was or is still an RSS member. Yeah. So, you know, that it's not unthinkable, but it's not today the case that the RSS plays the same kind of role as the CPC does. No, party members in every workplace, 90 million members.
Yes, that's the largest political party in the world.
By a long way, I guess. I mean, I don't know what the size of the BJP is, but it ain't 90 million, I wouldn't guess.
Yes,
sorry, this is becoming a dialogue between two people.
Sorry, yeah.
No, I just wanted to add a little bit to what Anilesh wanted to say, because I kind of understand where he's coming from, but I also do not have a very clear understanding of the Chinese media, but at least from what I have kind of understood in the last half a year or something of being here from my Chinese classmates, is that it is very, very different. It's more of a, I mean, it does come down to this kind of postmodern idea of freedom and liberty, and also this, I don't know, I think it was Isaiah Berlin who talked about this negative and positive liberty and so on. But in any ways, I think Chinese media is more of a PR, whereas in India, we still have a lot of independent. I mean, of course, it's becoming one of the most unsafe countries for journalists in Asia, but there are still a lot of independent news outlets and, I don't know, media outlets which are still kind of exploiting on whatever ideas of freedom and liberty we have left. So it's not just PR. You can, I mean, of course, there are major news channels, are what you said, are dictated by this marriage of economy and politics. So it's like capital and politics which is dictating them. But I think India still has some liberties and freedoms when it comes to this kind of media control.
I agree with him.
Sorry, it was a monologue, but I just wanted to clear, because I of course, I had the same comparison as Anilesh. I also came to here, I was like, okay, how is this functioning here? And it does seem a lot similar on the surface, though.
Yes, I mean, just to put it on record, Professor Song and Professor Sparks, you know, I'm on a visa, I have to go back to India. So just to reiterate, I never said that India has become China in terms of media and journalism. That's what I was alluding to, because you talked about the experience of one of your collaborators being an investigative journalist. And before starting this PhD, I was working as an investigative journalist with the most popular Indian news network, based in India, and I've also worked in London. And I was thinking about in terms of investigative journalism, which is happening in our country. And if you see the investigative journalism, which is happening or which is done by a large section of Indian media, and I'm underlining it, a large section of the mainstream media, is while they're investigating the opposition, not the people who are in power. So when I was part of the newsroom and when we had to do stories, the only way I would console myself would be thinking, okay, I know I'm doing story against A, B, C politician, and he belongs only, or they belong only to the opposition, which should not be a surprise to anyone. But so long as it is based on facts, it should give me some consolation, some sort of moral, moral upliftment that I'm doing something based on facts. Now, as you said, the journalism industry in India, mainly television, it's not fully controlled by the government, but there is a growing trend where there are separate offices set up by the ruling party, where every frame of a large section of mainstream media is being monitored, like every single frame. They may not have people sitting in the offices, just as you mentioned about what is happening in China, but they have people from their social media departments sitting in the offices of news channels and telling them what to write hashtags on the social media pages of mainstream media news organizations. And they have a separate monitoring team which looks into every single frame of the primetime news channels. That is why I said there is a lot of similarity between what you were talking and what was happening in China. I didn't say that it has completely become China, but I was talking about the trend, which might be interesting to investigate. Sorry about eating at this time.
No, that's fine. And just one thing that I think, you say you're happy when you're writing a story, even if you're attacking the opposition, that you're based on facts. Yeah. Now, I think that one thing that people don't understand is that Chinese journalists report facts. They don't tell lies. That in general they don't tell lies. They simply report. They're much more vocally objectivist than you would imagine. And, there's a Western belief that they're all sitting around telling lies. It's just nonsense. It's not true. They learn that at journalism school that you separate fact and opinion. But as you must know, there are facts and facts. There are facts you can report and facts you can't report. Facts you do report and facts you don't report. And that's true in Britain, and it's true in China, and it's true, I'm sure, in India. That it's not so much facticity, and those sorts of things. It's what what is often called framing, by Entman and others. So a well-established theory of what happens in journalism. Which facts you select, how you relate them to each other, what emphasis you give to them, and so forth. Yeah, that's present in all journalism, in Indian journalism, in British journalism, in American journalism, and in Chinese journalism. Yes, there are differences, but that facticity is not the key differentiating thing. The other thing I'd say to you, you should talk, both you and Rajat should talk more thoroughly to. I'm not sure about. I don't know any of the people here who are Chinese, who have Chinese names. But one of the things that really struck me recently, coming back to the UK, and meeting what do you meet when you go to a university in Britain? You meet Chinese MA students, thousands of them, as many as in Hong Kong, and we were talking about media and development, which is what I was teaching, and there was a thing about one of the questions she asked is democracy necessary for development? Yeah? Sorry, is democracy only present in advanced countries, something like that? Yes, and various Chinese students said to me, no, it's not, blah, 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 blah. I said, well, the problem you have with this is India, because India is a developing country. It's not terribly rich, but it is now and has been since 1947, apart from the 1976 interlude with Mrs. Gandhi, is a democracy. And to my amazement and surprise, they said, yes, that's the problem that India has. That's why China is 20, 30, 40 years ahead of India. So you should talk to some Chinese people and see, because I found that quite a shock. And what you used to get 20 years ago, 10 years ago was, well, democracy is a good idea, but China can become democratic when it's rich. We're not ready yet for democracy. Now, there's a strong current of opinion in China. I don't know whether it's reflected in academic work or not, but it certainly filters into young intellectuals, is that democracy is an obstacle to development. Democracy and democratic journalism is even more of an obstacle to development. And that, I think, it would be worth exploring if you want to understand the differences between India and because I'm sure there are people in India who say the same thing, but I was surprised to hear it from Chinese people. Chinese intellectuals, young Chinese intellectuals.
Any questions?
Last week I was talking about being suspicious of national stereotypes, but there is a national stereotype of Indians that they like to argue. So perhaps anyway.
Okay, so last but not least, I really like to say a big thank you to Professor Colin Sparks. Thanks for all this very insightful and enlightening talks. Each week, it has been like a brain exercise full of stimulating insights. Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you all for listening. I hope it wasn't too pointless. And as I said to both to Huang Yu and to Song Yun Ya, I'm happy to do these things, and to just ask me to do more if you want them. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, Colin.